It's 1347. You live in a small European town. Nothing special. You wake up, you go to the market, you argue with your neighbor about a goat, you go to bed. Normal life, the kind of day you'd forget by dinner. Except there's a dead rat by the grain store, and you don't think anything of it. Why would you? Rats die all the time. They're just background noise, part of living in a town with grain stores and stables and gutters running down the middle of the street. A few days later, your neighbor has a fever, then swelling under his arms, hard, painful lumps the size of eggs. His skin starts turning dark in patches, almost black. Then he's dead. Within a week, half the street is sick, and the priest is running out of prayers to say fast enough. You have no idea what's happening. Nobody does. Not the doctors, not the priests, not the king. And here's the question this video is going to answer. Why did it take over 500 years for anyone to figure out what was actually killing people? And how did something this small, something you could barely see, almost wipe out half of an entire continent? Let's start at stage 1, the first infections. In October of 1347, 12 ships from the Black Sea dock at the port of Messina in Sicily. Word spreads fast, but not because of anything good. The sailors on board are dead or dying, covered in black swollen lumps. Some of them delirious with fever, some of them already gone. The town official who orders the ships out of the harbor is too late. It's already off the boats. Nobody connects it to anything because there's nothing to connect it to. There's no concept of germs. There's no concept of bacteria. Medicine at this point is basically vibes, prayer, and whatever a physician read in a book written 1,000 years earlier. The leading medical theory of the time is called miasma theory. Bad smells cause disease. That's it. That's the actual science being taught in universities. If a place smells bad, if the air feels corrupted, it will make you sick. So doctors are out here recommending people carry bouquets of flowers around, stuff their pockets with herbs, burn incense in the streets, all to ward off bad air. Meanwhile, the actual cause is living in the fur of the rats running through every grain store, stable, and ship's hold in Europe. It's kind of like blaming your headache on Wi-Fi radiation instead of the fact that you haven't had water in 6 hours. Wrong theory, extremely high confidence. Stage 2. The spread accelerates. The disease moves along trade routes because of course it does. Wherever there's a ship, a caravan, a market town, the disease travels with it, riding in grain sacks and cargo holds. Fleas living on black rats are carrying a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. When a flea bites you, it's not just annoying, it's injecting bacteria directly into your bloodstream. The flea itself is basically a tiny, unwilling delivery system for one of the deadliest organisms in human history. By early 1348, the disease reaches Florence. Within months, contemporary writers describe the city losing more than half its population. Boccaccio, writing about Florence during the outbreak, describes healthy people eating breakfast with friends and having dinner with their ancestors in the afterlife by nightfall. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's roughly how fast this moved. But nobody knows the actual cause yet, so the theories get worse before they get better. Some people blame the position of the planets, insisting a rare alignment of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars poisoned the air. Some blame sin, convinced God is punishing entire towns for moral failure. Groups called flagellants form and travel from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public squares, convinced that enough public suffering will convince God to lift the plague. For a while, entire towns welcome them as saviors. Within a couple of years, the church itself starts banning the movement, partly because the flagellants start declaring their own authority over the church, and partly because, unsurprisingly, marching large groups of people covered in open wounds from town to town does not slow down a disease spread by fleas and close contact. It does the opposite. And some, tragically, blame Jewish communities, leading to horrific violence and massacres across parts of Europe that had nothing to do with the actual cause and everything to do with fear looking for someone to punish. It's the medieval version of blaming your bad luck on Mercury retrograde, except with catastrophically higher stakes and a body count, instead of a bad Tuesday. Stage 3. The death toll climbs and the cures get worse. Doctors at this point are wearing long-beaked masks stuffed with herbs and dried flowers, believing the beak filters out the bad air before it reaches them. They're bloodletting patients, draining blood from already weakened, dehydrated bodies, because ancient medical theory says disease comes from an imbalance of the body's four humors. They're lancing the swollen lumps, called buboes. sometimes helping by accident, sometimes just spreading the infection faster through open wounds. Picture your current wellness influencer, but instead of recommending cold plunges, collagen powder, and morning sunlight, they're recommending you cut yourself open and drain your blood into a bowl on the kitchen table. Same confidence, same certainty they're right, wildly, catastrophically different outcome. By this stage, entire villages are being abandoned overnight. Families leave sick relatives behind, sometimes literally locking them inside their homes and walking away. People flee cities entirely, which ironically just spreads the disease to more towns faster, since infected fleas and rats travel right along with them. Doctors refuse house calls. Priests refuse to perform burials because there are too many bodies and not enough hands to dig graves. In London, city officials open mass burial pits that fill up faster than they can be dug. Entire streets go silent, some literally boarded shut with the sick still inside. Stage 4, peak devastation. By the time the first wave finally slows down around 1351, somewhere between 1/3 and half of Europe's entire population is dead. Not sick, dead. Some historians estimate as many as 50 million people in a world with a fraction of today's population. Entire towns are wiped off the map completely, never rebuilt, their ruins still occasionally found today. Labor shortages are so severe they actually shift the entire economic structure of Europe because suddenly there aren't enough surviving workers left to farm the land, forcing landowners to start paying wages to peasants for the first time in generations just to get anyone to work the fields. And it doesn't even end there. The plague returns in smaller waves roughly every decade for the next several centuries because nobody has figured out the actual cause, which means nobody has figured out how to stop it from coming back. And here's the twist. The actual cause, the flea, the rat, the bacterium, was right there the entire time. People saw the rats dying in the streets before the outbreaks. People saw the fleas. Nobody made the connection because the concept of a microscopic organism causing disease simply didn't exist yet. There was no microscope powerful enough, no framework for thinking that small. Germ theory wouldn't be scientifically proven until the 1800s by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, roughly 500 years after the first outbreak swept through Messina. The bacterium itself, Yersinia pestis, wasn't formally identified until 1894 by a scientist named Alexandre Yersin during an outbreak in Hong Kong. That's over 500 years of guessing, blaming, whipping, bloodletting, and dying when the answer was living in the walls, the grain stores, and the fur of the rats the entire time. Think about that. 500 years of miasma theory, sin theory, planet theory, 500 years of beak masks and bloodletting and blaming your neighbors for something they had absolutely nothing to do with. And the real answer, the thing that caused all of it, was a flea riding a rat carrying a bacterium too small for the human eye to ever detect without help. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't punishment from above. It wasn't the planets lining up wrong. It was a tiny, invisible organism that nobody on Earth had the tools to see yet, let alone understand or stop. So the next time you get a headache and immediately blame stress, or bad sleep, or Mercury retrograde, remember this story. Remember the beaked masks and the bloodletting and the 500 years of confident wrong answers. Sometimes the real explanation isn't mystical. It isn't cosmic. It's small, it's biological, and it's been sitting right in front of us the whole time, quietly waiting for someone to finally get close enough and curious enough to actually see it.